So here's your next section. What is an annotated bibliography? Overview and definitions. So essentially, you are describe, summarize, and or evaluate a list of citations to be used in a research project. It allows you to inform readers of the relevance, accuracy, and quality of the sources used in a research project. And then it allows you to determine the usefulness of a source in comparison to other sources on the topic. So you want to describe what is the source, what type of source it is, then provide some brief summary. So that means you should have a good understanding enough to be able to summarize. And summarize really is no different than explaining it to someone. That's how you know you are learning something beyond you just sitting down and reading it yourself, that you can summarize it to someone if they ask you a question, if the person asks you a question. And then evaluate a list of citations, meaning that you are being a little biased here, that you are evaluating whether or not it is useful for your project, right? Whether or not it is useful as a source, really. That means that's why you have to know the difference between your primary and secondary sources, because if something is data written, in a sense, you don't want a third party source or a secondary source to provide or serve as the main source of repute, right? So if you want to get marriage certificates, marriage data, marriage and divorce data, you don't go and read, you can read the scholarship on it, right, to look at the arguments, but when you need the numbers, you want to go to the organization that initially gathered the numbers or gathered the data, so that if you are evaluating, when you look at the horse's mouth, so to speak, you can trust those numbers versus those numbers being integrated into another source that is a secondary source. So evaluating, of course, when you are evaluating the initial organization that gathered the data, that conducted the studies and gathered the data and then reported on them, you want to look at how the organization creates hypotheses, the research methodology, how they interpret the numbers, and then how they report those results. That's also evaluating too, so that whatever you represent in your work, in your paper, or anything that you are doing, someone could then come along and read and be able to find those same numbers with the initial organization and trust that you did a great job in integrating that information into your paper. So evaluating is very important. Informing the readers of the relevance, accuracy, and quality of the sources. So relevance is always connected to whether or not it is relevant to your topic. You could have many sources on the topic, but not necessarily all of them be relevant to the argument that you are putting forth, because by the time you get to those last reasons, you are now formulating a thesis, right? And so now you have to look at those sources to see if each source is going to support or oppose that thesis. And even if they do support or oppose, do you really need that information in your paper? Would it take the argument of the paper too far off your initial purpose? So relevance does matter. Accuracy, of course, making sure that anything that you present within your paper is accurate. That's why annotated bibliography process gives you that opportunity to check your sources, to go back and look at them, look at the content, make sure that how you are representing those sources is accurate. So if you create the content and you have the patience while creating the annotated bibliography, then it's going to be much easier for you to then just cut and paste that content into your paper. And then that way you resolve any issues with accuracy. Then quality of the sources, depending upon what types of sources you are using, quality does matter. So if you are using primary sources, like you are getting say you want to integrate legal information. You have people who interpret legal information, and then you have the actual source of the legal information. And so if they are mentioning the 13th Amendment, you may want their analysis in your paper of the 13th Amendment, but you also want to quote the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in your paper from the actual legislative source, right? The Constitution itself. And you can access the U.S. Constitution online just by typing it in as a keyword search. And so you get the direct law or constitutional provision, integrate that into your paper, and then you can support that with the analysis from that particular author, attorney, politician, or whoever who is saying something about the 13th Amendment. The annotated bibliography allows you to determine the usefulness of a source in comparison to other sources on the topic. So that goes back to, say, evaluation, that all your sources, if you are looking at 50 sources on a topic, all of them are useful, because someone can use those sources. But for a 5 to 8 page paper, sometimes 10-page paper, you have to determine if that 1 to 5 sources that you like or you think are useful for your particular argument. You may have to set them aside and consider them later for another assignment. But you have to be succinct. You can't be too broad within a 5 to 8 page paper. And you want to make sure that you don't lose your reader. So determining the usefulness of a source does take a little bit of time, because you have to put aside your own ego. You have to put aside sometimes your own zeal and enthusiasm to just bring in every source under the sun. And knowing that you're not going to be able to do that for a 5 to 8 page paper. Even if you were writing a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation, and you need probably a minimum of 200 plus sources, even within that range of sources, you still want to evaluate. You still want to determine the usefulness of a source. Sometimes it may have to form a resources section of your thesis or your dissertation instead of being integrated into the main content. So that gives you something to think about as well. Always remember that sources are considered annotated bibliography entries and must be formatted according to the appropriate citation referencing style. So MLA is usually for arts and humanities. APA is for psychology and the sciences. Chicago style is usually for publishing context. And then also you may want to speak with a reference librarian to locate scholarly sources. So if you are very good at researching, sometimes you may not, but there are some sources that you may not be privy to because they may require a certain account. And usually if you are affiliated with an institution as a student or as a staff member or faculty member, you usually have access to that information. So speaking to a reference librarian would inform you whether or not you had access to that source without having to pay for it. So that's very important as well. So let's look at the distinctions between what a bibliography is, what the annotation does, and what an annotated bibliography does as well. So in terms of a bibliography, it's just a list of sources and references considered. So there's a difference. If you are writing a paper and you have to use MLA style, then your last references area of the paper would be titled Works Cited, meaning that whatever work you cited within the paper would go on that list. However, for certain papers, and sometimes I permit this in my classes, that if you created works cited entries, but then there were some sources you considered but didn't necessarily quote within your paper, then you could title it bibliography. If you were writing a paper that required the APA referencing citation style, then that referencing paper, section of your paper would be titled references. So do keep the differences in mind. A bibliography is just a list of sources, references considered. This includes sources you cite within your paper and sources you merely considered in terms of historical reference, and then consideration of sources may fall under common knowledge. So sometimes you don't always have to cite reference to the 13th Amendment or any other constitutional provision or laws or civil rights legislation or something like that. Sometimes you don't always have to cite that. You don't need an end of the sentence citation because it's considered common knowledge. We understand the American Revolution, we understand the Civil War, those dates, right? They repeat all the time. We hear them all the time. When the holiday comes along, we know what the date is. So you don't necessarily have to have a citation reference in terms of an end of the sentence citation at the end of the sentence, right? Because that's common knowledge. But anyone who is saying something about that historical reference in terms of their analysis in their book, then you do have to reference that information in your paper, integrated and appropriately formatted. So annotation gives you a description, a summary, evaluation, critical scholarly evaluation, and then commentary and analysis. And so this is really no different than you integrating a source in your paper. The steps that you should take. So there's the pre-quote information, which is your setup, and then you integrate the quote. You follow up the quote with some kind of explanation and then evaluate it, which represents your commentary. Well, annotations kind of work the same way: reflection, summary, analysis, and reflection. And we're going to go over that as well. And then annotated bibliography allows you to use your intellectual skills. It requires that you be informed or you integrate informed library research. You get the opportunity to summarize the theme, thesis of authors' works. So that's very important, that you don't just integrate a source without telling the reader who the author is, what the title of the work is, what the thesis is. Evaluate the author's background, which speaks to credibility. So an author is writing on a particular topic. What kind of background does the person have? Have they taught in the topic? Have they written any books? Do they present at conferences? Something that says to the reader that you have prepared enough to know that you understand the author, what the author brings to the table in terms of your paper, and how important it is to consider this particular author. Provides information on intended audience. So not everyone is going to read your paper. Not everyone cares about the topic. So you do want to make sure that you tailor your audience. Sometimes, depending upon the topic, sometimes you may have to explain certain technical terms. But if you are presenting in front of a largely technical audience who understands those terms, you can speak in acronyms, right? You don't necessarily have to spell out the acronyms or provide a definition for every single term that you mention because of the audience. But for certain audience and for certain papers, you may have to present the meaning of the acronym and then just refer to the acronym right throughout the rest of your paper. And then comparison contrast work. So this allows you, if you do an annotated bibliography, this allows you to see, of course, who is saying what about the topic, but then look at the differences, what one person is saying about a particular area of the topic and what another person is saying about the same area of the topic. And then that gives you a compare contrast target. And then establishes preparation for a research topic. So you will often hear people say that this book was heavily researched, right? This this author really did his or her research. Well, that's very telling, because you thought enough of the topic and the audience and the professors and practitioners and staff members to do your homework, which that's what the annotated bibliography is basically doing your homework before you enter the project. So these are your distinctions.